we need to be more careful about our diet and lifestyle because we are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes than most other populations. There's actually some potentially genetic components to that. Like we tend to have higher lipids, higher LDL cholesterol, higher Lp(a), which is another marker that increases risk that is totally genetically determined. We tend to have higher ones. We also tend to have lower what are called fat thresholds. So we each have an individual threshold of body fat that we can put on before we develop diabetes. And South Asians tend to have a lower threshold. So we don't have as much wiggle room. We tend to store more fat around our organs, which increases insulin resistance and other issues.
Welcome to Kula, the community for South Asian health. Kula is a Sanskrit word for community, which is what this podcast is all about, bringing together a community of the leading South Asian health experts to talk all things health, fitness, and nutrition. Poor dietary habits and lack of exercise in our community are leading to increased rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, a negative trend that requires radical change. I'm your host, Krish Nandkeshwar, a health and fitness enthusiast, competitor, and coach motivated to educate and inspire the South Asian community to live healthier and combat disease. I interviewed the top South Asian health experts, including doctors, athletes, fitness coaches, and nutritionists, to share their expertise and educate us all on how we can live healthier that is unique to our South Asian identities. Thank you all for listening, and welcome to all the new listeners. So far, we have received very positive feedback, and I'm really excited to share the future episodes with you all. If you like what you hear, please like, subscribe, share, and spread the word. On this episode, I interviewed Dr. Matthew Nagra, a naturopathic doctor based out of Vancouver, Canada. We dive deep into the nutritional and health benefits of a plant-based diet, focusing on fiber, cholesterol, saturated fat, dairy, eggs, a whole bunch of topics. Take out your notepad. This is an exciting one. You're going to learn a lot. All right, welcome back to the pod, guys. Super excited to be joined today with Dr. Matt Nagra, who's a naturopathic doctor based out of Vancouver, Canada. I'm going to have to read this because there's a lot of accolades I need to get out here. So he's living a plant-based vegan lifestyle and grew up, struggling with his own health issues that some of us might have experienced ourselves. And like many of us, also had a family member that had cardiovascular disease. He's a graduate from Boucher Institute of Naturopathic Medicine and holds a BS in microbiology from the University of Victoria, along with several additional board certifications, including immunizations, prescriptive authority, and advanced injection therapies. He also holds a plant-based nutrition certification from Cornell. He's passionate on educating the community on a plant-based diet and even vegan diet by sharing accurate, evidence-based information. Thank you. And to combat heart disease, food sensitivities, diabetes, digestive issues, high blood pressure, acne, just to name a few. And he's authored many articles on the topic, has multiple podcasts and seminars, including from The Proof and Mastering Diabetes, and several speaking events. So Matt is very knowledgeable in this space. And what I also like is he grew up as an athlete playing soccer, ice hockey, has a blue belt in jiu-jitsu and even a black belt in taekwondo. Dr. Matt, I feel like your parents would be
very few people mention that one, but
yeah, very, very proud of you. I thought that was really cool. How are you doing? Tell us about yourself.
I'm good. I mean, I think you said, or you hit a lot of the main points there. Like we were just speaking before recording, I'm out in Vancouver. We've had a bit of a snowstorm last couple of days, and a snowstorm for us might be nothing compared to some places, Eastern Canada, for example. But usually when we get this, it really shuts down the city. So I've kind of been locked inside for the last day or so, but it's good. It's been good. Otherwise, been very productive.
Awesome. Glad to hear you're staying warm. And just before I forget, we can find him at drmatthewnagra.com and also on Instagram at dr.matthewnagra. So tell me about your cultural background. What's your family background?
So my family's from India. I was born and raised in BC, though. I've been back to India only once so far. I do want to go back again. But my parents moved when they were very, very young. My mom, I believe, was 10 when she came to Canada, and my dad, I think, was 6. I might be slightly off on those numbers, but somewhere in that ballpark. And so, yeah, I've been, I'm totally Canadian through and through. It's, to be specific, for those who are wondering, it's more northwestern, like Punjab region of India.
Awesome. And so, explain a little bit about your mission of kind of growing into becoming a naturopathic doctor. How did you fall into this field? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, so as you alluded to, when I was younger, I did have some health issues. I had asthma that at sometimes was very bad. I struggled, allergies. I think that's super common, um, and had some skin issues and struggled to lose weight, even though I participated in tons of sports, and you highlighted some of them there, and I still do participate in sports today. And so I had a personal trainer at a point. This was back when I was actually playing football, American football, on top of soccer and other sports. And he really pushed a more plant based approach. Now, he wasn't strictly plant based, he wasn't vegan, but definitely pushed a predominantly plant based diet. And when he wanted me to record what I was eating on a food diary, I was very hesitant just because my diet was not the cleanest, we'll say. I mean, not that I like the terms clean and unclean, maybe I shouldn't say that, but it just wasn't the healthiest by conventional standards. And so I wanted to trick him a little bit into thinking that I ate a lot healthier than I typically did. So I actually changed my diet for that period. I didn't lie on the food diary, but I did change it to eliminate, actually at the time, dairy, a lot of the ultra processed foods I was eating, potato chips, candy, sodas, Coca Cola, that kind of thing. And I started feeling better. I also reduced my meat intake and increased my fruit and veg intake, and I started feeling better. The weight started melting off. Skin was clearing up, breathing easier. I started to notice some changes. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe he's onto something. Maybe there's something to this. And over the subsequent couple of years, I just continued to learn more and more from what I could. I mean, I was a teenager at the time. I'm learning a lot from books and media and blogs and that kind of stuff. Probably the same way that a lot of your listeners might. And um, eventually, when I was in university, I noticed that my health was slipping a bit the other way as I was eating more cafeteria food. I was going out drinking on the weekends and that sort of stuff. And so after my first semester, I actually decided that, you know what, I was feeling way better when I was eating healthier. I'm going to go 100%. And I went 100% overnight plant based and haven't really looked back since. And it's been how long now? 13 years almost next month, I think. So yeah, been at it for a while.
That's great. I love this breakdown of how you experience it yourself. Now, let's start from the very basic level. Explain to us plant-based versus vegan,
Mhm.
vegetarian. Just let's break it down from there so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah, so a vegan diet, so to speak, I guess could describe a diet that is exclusively plant-based, only plants. And in the medical scientific literature, that is how it's defined typically. However, I do want to emphasize that a vegan diet or a plant-based diet does not necessarily mean that you are a vegan, right? So veganism is based on your moral principles. So it's the idea that you don't want to violate the rights of animals, their right to life. You don't want to, rob them of their life against their will, that sort of thing, or harm them. And so that needs to be a bit separated from specifically the dietary definitions. So now, as I said, a vegan diet or plant exclusive diet is 100% plant based. A plant based diet can have a broader definition, though. It can include the Mediterranean diet, the DASH diet, etc., which are predominantly plant based. You're getting the vast majority of your calories from plant foods. Let's say 75, 80% plus of your calories coming from plants, but you can possibly have some, dairy, some fish, small amounts of meat, and still fit under that umbrella of what a Mediterranean diet, so to speak, would be. So those, and then vegetarian would be a diet that excludes meat, but still includes eggs, dairy, and so on. And then you can break it down further into like subcategories of vegetarian diets, but I feel like that's maybe a bit too much for right now. And I actually realized I didn't answer the question about what brought me eventually to naturopathic medicine. So maybe I'll step back and answer that. I kind of talked about what brought me to
Yeah.
plant-based nutrition. So then when I was in university, I actually had one of my instructors. I was thinking of going into the healthcare field. That's sort of what I was aiming for. And one of my teachers actually saw a couple naturopathic doctors. They were actually a couple and they worked in the same clinic and saw them for different reasons. And she suggested that I maybe shadow them for a couple days. So I reached out to them and I sat in and I started looking into the field a little bit prior as well. And I really I was a bit shocked as to like what they could do within their practice and what was in that scope of naturopathic medicine, because what you often read about doesn't include the fact that you can prescribe medications, you can send for blood work, obviously you can do the nutrition counseling. Like, it's a very broad scope. And so I was just impressed at that, and I thought, well, I can have the best of both worlds. I can still treat people with medicine as needed, and incorporate that, but I can also focus on the clinical nutrition side. And there are some other practices within the umbrella of naturopathic medicine that I'm not really a fan of. I don't think are supported by good evidence, but I don't have to practice those. That's the beauty of it. I can focus on those areas that I think have really solid evidence that work, and ignore the areas that maybe don't as much. So that is ultimately what led me to wanting to go that route versus solely into medicine, where maybe I wouldn't have as much time or education around nutrition. Or going into like dietetics where it's solely nutrition. I can mix and match.
Yeah, it's a lot more holistic, I'd say. Um, I'm not too familiar with the whole medical differentiations. I'm not in that space, but I love to hear that you chose that path based off of what you were seeing as you're growing up. Let's go deep into this plant based mainly, and
Mm-hmm.
we can talk vegan, we can talk vegetarian. I really want to learn or really teach the listeners like what that means in terms of food. So we can throw out food items. We can talk about cholesterol. And we can talk about eggs and ultra processed food and meat. So we'll go into there, but let's pull back again and think about how, like, the research that you've looked at, how has like plant-based nutrition affected or had an impact in a positive way or negative, but I'm thinking positive here, on weight management, acne, injuries, heart disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, all the things to name that you can see. What are we looking at here, and what's your overall kind of rundown on that?
With like pertaining to the research on plant-based diets and those outcomes.
Yeah, if you can pick a few, where would
Yeah.
you say like things have been improving?
Yeah, I mean, I like, this is probably the area that I talk about most. I like starting maybe with cardiometabolic diseases, so things like
Sure.
cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. I think those are areas where we have a very solid understanding of how nutrition plays a role. And like, there are some areas like acne you mentioned where there's some evidence for sure, and we can touch on some of that, but it's not as clear cut, and there's certainly more research to be done. But with cardiovascular disease, diabetes, I mean, I think it's pretty clear. So with cardiovascular disease, there are a few main factors. Now, there might be more that are unknown, but there are a few main factors that we know are related to our diet that can impact risk. So, for one, fiber intake. Two, saturated fat intake. Three, to a degree, but maybe not as much, dietary cholesterol intake. Those are a few that are really going to impact risk. Oh, and then on the positive side, I should also say polyunsaturated fats. So when we look at research on fiber intake, it doesn't matter what population we're looking at. It doesn't matter if we're talking about men, women. Um, we see very consistently a clear what's called a dose response relationship. So as you increase the dose, we see just a linear, straight line of benefit when it comes to cardiovascular disease reduction. And this is at more of the population level. So when you're looking at what are called prospective cohort studies, where you enroll sometimes tens of thousands, sometimes even more, hundreds of thousands of participants, follow them for a period of time after determining what they're eating and tracking their dietary intake, and seeing, do those who eat more fiber have a lower risk or higher risk compared to those who eat less. And we see very consistently that there's a lower risk of things like cardiovascular disease. And this is after adjusting for confounders. So you're essentially comparing people of a similar age, same sex, similar perhaps sugar sweetened beverage intake, one study that comes to mind in particular, similar exercise habits, similar smoking habits, and so on. So you're kind of removing those variables. And so that is the type of data that can tell us about the end result. The end result being, do you have a heart attack or a stroke? And that is ultimately what's most important at the end of the day. However, we also have numerous randomized controlled trials that are run over a number of weeks that look at how, say, fiber can impact cholesterol levels, or blood pressure or weight, for example. And we also see the higher fiber intake generally at worst has a neutral effect on some of these markers, but typically leads to benefit, especially for cholesterol levels and for blood pressure and for weight. At least in the fiber supplement trials, are generally a small reduction as well. It's not a massive reduction, but a little bit. So we're seeing benefit for the markers. We're seeing benefit for the end result. Now, some people will argue that we need long-term randomized controlled trials to really tell whether there's a cause and effect relationship. This would mean where you take a bunch of people, split them in half, give one an intervention, say more fiber, give another either different intervention or no intervention, and seeing what happens. And we don't necessarily have super long-term randomized controlled trials on just, say, fiber supplementation and these outcomes, but we do on higher fiber diets versus lower fiber diets. And pretty much across the board, when we do that, we see that there is benefit as well. Is that due to the fiber per se in that case, or is it due to some other variables? It's harder to tease out in that sense because there's usually a few things changing. But when you pair that with the long-term cohort studies that do adjust for the rest of the diet or other factors, and you compare that you pair that with the randomized controlled trials looking at these individual markers, blood pressure, cholesterol, etc., it paints a pretty clear picture. So that would highlight at least the fiber portion. Now
before we go to the next
saturated
one,
fat, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
before we go to the next one, because I want to break these down individually. So
Oh yeah, please do.
fiber. Let's give some example. So that's just more plants. What are your key foods that you're saying that we need to be intaking? A diversity. List out a few of them that you want, the general population to be eating more
Yeah.
of.
Yeah, so fiber is, there's a couple different kinds of fiber or classes of fiber, soluble fiber and insoluble fiber. Plant foods are generally going to have a mix of the two, and they have slightly different functions in the body. Like soluble fiber is really good for lowering cholesterol. Insoluble fiber can help with moving the stool along in the digestive tract and so on. And so sources of fiber are going to generally be whole or minimally processed plant foods. Those are going to be your best sources. And you'll get that fiber from fruits, veggies, whole grains, legumes like beans, chickpeas, lentils, and then nuts and seeds as well. Those are going to be your main sources. Even heavily processed plant foods will generally have some fiber, but it'll be a very small amount because a lot of it gets removed in that process of processing the food. And so that might be one reason that those foods are often not as healthy as like the whole foods. But so if you wanted some specific examples, I'll actually highlight soluble fiber and insoluble. Or insoluble. If you're wanting sources that are rich in soluble fiber, fruits are generally going to be really good, especially those gooier fruits like berries, for example.
Yep.
For veggies, eggplant or okra, again, that sort of gooey texture, slimy texture, that's some of the soluble fiber there. And then your beans, lentils, and so on are pretty good sources as well. For insoluble fiber, you're going to get a lot more of those from things like nuts, from a lot of the other tougher veggies. When you think of like cruciferous veggies, for example, broccoli, kale, etc. Again, from some grains. But you're just to step back, you're getting both types from all of these foods, just in varying proportions. And as a kind of broad recommendation, just eating more of these healthy plant foods is really just going to help maximize your fiber intake.
Perfect. Nailed exactly what I was trying to get answered there. Now, does it matter the way you cook your food? So you do like eggplant, for example. Does it change the fiber if you do it in different ways, or broccoli, whether you're steaming it, roasting it? Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah, I've heard some of those questions. Not meaningfully from what I've seen. It's not really going to affect the fiber too much. I mean, there's certain nutrients that are more heat sensitive, like vitamin C, for example. But even then, it's not like you're destroying all of the vitamin C in a food by cooking it or cooking it at high temperatures, but you might reduce it to a degree. I think getting bogged down into different cooking practices is really just kind of missing the forest for the trees kind of thing. I think
All right.
by and large, just eating more of these foods, whether you will eat more if they were baked or roasted or boiled or steamed, like whatever you're going to eat more of, I think is really the ideal.
Got it. So part one of this plant-based is fiber. Part two,
Yeah.
saturated fat. Let's go.
Yeah. Yeah, so saturated fat, the nice thing about eating a plant-based diet is almost by default, unless you're really trying, you're probably going to be eating fairly low saturated fat. Saturated fat is solid at room temperature. So when you think of butter, right, that's solid typically. So that's going to be very rich in saturated fat. Coconut oil, actually, speaking of a plant source, it's rich in saturated fat. Palm oil is another plant source. But other than that, you're not really getting too much saturated fat from most plant sources. Most of it's going to come from butter, meat, and other high fat dairy products. Now, there is a bit of nuance to this topic, but generally speaking, saturated fat raises your LDL cholesterol levels, which is in your blood, and as that builds up, can end up inside the what's called the subendothelial space. It's the inner lining of the artery wall, and it'll
Yep.
eventually build up into a plaque, and then several decades down the road, it will potentially cause a heart attack. That is the really quick of it, and so you generally want to limit saturated fat, um, and then on the flip side, increase polyunsaturated fat because that does the opposite by lowering LDL cholesterol. But we'll get to that in a little bit. So like what's ideal for saturated fat? It depends on where you look. The general dietary guidelines are to keep saturated fat under 10% of total calories. That would be, if you're eating an average diet, that would be like a couple tablespoons of butter in a whole day, excluding all other saturated fat sources. So it can add up really quick if you're eating saturated fat rich foods. But generally speaking, lower is better. The American Heart Association, for example, recommends under 7% of calories, which is even less. Um, and now I don't think people need to go and calculate all of this. I think if you're just limiting intake of meat, high fat dairy products, and especially butter, and you're replacing that with more polyunsaturated fat sources like your liquid oils, your olive oil, canola oil, etc., or nuts and seeds and plant protein sources, you're generally going to be doing pretty well in the saturated fat department. Now, there is some controversy out there that gets raised around saturated fat. So, I mean, there were headlines in Time magazine like butter is back. There were a couple large meta analyses that came out in the early 2010s that suggested that saturated fat wasn't linked to cardiovascular disease. However, there are some major issues with them. And I'm not going to, I feel like we could get really into the weeds on this topic, but there's a couple big issues that apply pretty much across the board. One of them is that the difference between high saturated fat and low saturated fat intake in a lot of the studies that were included is pretty small. In order to see if a food increases your risk of disease, you need to have a decent contrast between what's considered high and low in a given study. Think of smoking, for
Right.
example. If you were to conduct a study comparing people who smoke 6 cigarettes a day versus those who smoke 5 cigarettes a day, are you really going to see a difference in their risk? Probably not, right? But if you compare people who don't smoke at all or smoke like a cigarette a day to people who smoke a pack a day, you're obviously going to see a more substantial difference in risk. And it's the same sort of thing with nutrition. So that's one issue. Another issue is even though they're looking at saturated fat intake and these, and say cardiovascular disease or other outcomes, they often equalize, they adjust for, which essentially means they're equalizing LDL cholesterol levels. So to explain why that's a problem, let's just do a little quick thought experiment here. Let's say you and I, we have vastly different genetics. I am genetically predisposed to a low LDL cholesterol. You're genetically predisposed to a higher LDL cholesterol level. Now, let's say you eat a very low saturated fat diet, but I eat a high saturated fat diet, raising my LDL cholesterol to be the same as yours. Now, conventional wisdom will suggest that I'm increasing my risk of cardiovascular disease because I'm eating more saturated fat. But if we compare you, who's eating low amounts of saturated fat, to me, who's eating high amounts of saturated fat, we're not going to see a difference in risk because our LDL is the same, right? Just based on
Mm.
genetics, you already had higher levels to begin with, and I've just matched you. That is essentially the issue that comes about when you do that sort of thing in a study and you equalize LDL cholesterol levels. If A leads to B and B leads to C, but you make sure B is equal across the board, you're not going to see a connection between A and C. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I have a question on that because
Yeah,
people
please
will
do.
look at you'll look at LDL levels and it's just a range. I mean, like, this is your LDL is high, it's low, it's in normal range, whatever. When you look at reports, and some of my clients will reach out to me like, "Hey, my LDL is high." Does that is that number, whether it's considered high in range, does that change per person then, or is it something where if it's over a certain number, maybe you can say that it's high like across the board, like it's equivalent to everybody, or it's
Oh,
like you just said, genetically
yeah,
different?
I get what you're saying. Yeah. So actually, there's studies on just genetically determined levels of LDL, and those who have genetically higher levels throughout their life have substantially higher risk of cardiovascular disease. It doesn't. There aren't really now. There might be very rare exceptions due to some other mechanism that's impacted, but generally speaking, you want your LDL to be low. If it's now if it's due to diet, let's say you're eating a high saturated fat keto diet, you should get off that diet and bring it down if your LDL is high. Now, if it's genetically elevated, there might not be much that you can do through diet, unfortunately, and that's a case where medication is considered because LDL itself can raise your risk substantially. Now, the goal number, are you based in the States? Or are you in Canada? Where are you based?
States, yeah, states.
States? Okay. So you use milligrams per deciliter down there. So an LDL cholesterol of 70 milligrams per deciliter or less is roughly around where atherosclerosis, that plaque buildup in the arteries, doesn't occur, or at least doesn't progress. So the ideal LDL would be under 70, or here in Canada, 1.8, because we use different units. That is the goal. You want to ideally be under that. If you're like slightly above, I mean, that's a judgment call. The risk is going to be pretty low, but the point at which we don't really see progression of plaque is under that threshold, and so that is generally what I recommend. Now, if people have the ability to measure ApoB, which is an even more accurate marker, LDL cholesterol is meant to sort of approximate ApoB. It generally correlates very well with ApoB, but there are certain people where it doesn't. If you can measure ApoB specifically, which is a little protein that's on the LDL particle, then that will give you a more exact measure and a more accurate predictor of risk. That should be under 80 or 0.8 here in Canada. So it depends on what you have access to as far as testing, but that's the ideal.
Great breakdown. How do we test one for ApoB, and how do you test to know if you're genetically higher or lower in with your LDL?
Yeah, so well, for ApoB, you would ask your doctor. It is making its way into guidelines. I know here up in in Canada, the Canadian Cardiovascular Society guidelines that were published a couple years ago, it was 2021, I think. They actually now say to consider ApoB. They're at least mentioning it, and I do think this will become common practice in the next 5, 6, 7 years. But it just hasn't quite caught up yet. But you can ask your doctor. They might not. You might have to pay out of pocket. I can't remember the exact cost up here. I think it's around. I should know this. It's on my website, but I think it's like 40 something bucks. But that'll vary depending on location, lab, etc. So that's one way. Now, as far as genetics, honestly, it doesn't really matter because now you can inquire about that. There are specialty labs that'll do that sort of testing. I know the lab that I work with doesn't, but I mean, there are other labs that might. But it doesn't really matter because it doesn't really change treatment. If you have high LDL and you've done all the dietary stuff and you're eating a low saturated fat diet, it's rich in soluble fiber and polyunsaturated fats, then chances are it's probably genetic if it's still elevated. Or at least a genetic component. It might not be familial hypercholesterolemia where it's sky high, but if it's still elevated at that point, you probably just have a higher genetic baseline. And if you're testing for familial hypercholesterolemia markers, well, it might be due to that. It might not. You don't know for sure. And even if it was, what is that going to change? The goal is still to lower it. You've done everything you can with lifestyle. At that point, you either consider potentially medication or you consider just living with that elevated risk, right? That's ultimately what it comes down to, or modifying other risk factors. And there are calculators that you can use to kind of estimate your risk.
Got it. Now, going on the risk part, so I always have this question because my mom will bring this up, being like, oh, if you go plant-based, it's going to decrease your risk by 10%. But do you know what the percentage are based off of? Or like a 10x increase or double, right? Is that off like 0.1% chance of risk and now it's 0.2% when you double it? Or is it something pretty significant where it's like 10% to 20% risk? Do you have
Uh,
any information on that?
yeah, that's the whole absolute versus relative risk stuff. Yeah, that's
Right,
a
right.
really good point. So um, now for like plant-based diets for risk that 10%. I don't know if that's a direct quote or not, but
No, this
that
is
really
me just
depends
throwing
on the
numbers. Yeah.
outcome. Yeah. These things would all depend on like baseline risk and what population. So let's just say that can vary a bit. But as far as like when say I cite a study and I'll say, oh, this intervention or exposure lowered risk of cardiovascular disease by 30% or something. That is typically going to be based off of the relative risk. So what they'll do, let's say they followed people for 15 years, and during that time, a bunch of them had heart attacks, and you find that those who ate, we'll say, less saturated fat had a roughly 30% lower risk during that time of having a heart attack or stroke compared to those eating higher saturated fat. That does not mean that if your current risk is your say lifetime risk, as people like to kind of expand it to, which they shouldn't. But let's say that you think your lifetime risk of having a heart attack is about 30%, which isn't far off from the truth for the average person anyway. Is that it's going to go to zero, right? That you're dropping it by 30% to zero. It's relative to that. So in that example, let's say your baseline risk is 30%, and you reduce that by 30%, you're now down to about 20%, right? Because a third,
Mm,
30% or a third of 30 is
got it.
10. So you subtract 10.
Yeah.
Um, that's how it works. Now, this gets abused. It gets so abused in the wrong way. It's not that people citing these relative risks are really the problem here. I mean, in certain cases it can be, but it's generally those who saying, oh, it's only a small absolute risk that are actually the ones that are making a huge mistake, because this number massively depends on follow-up time. So when you look at statin trials, like cholesterol lowering medication trials, they're generally what, 5 years, we'll say, something like that. And during that time, you might have a relative risk reduction of, we'll say, I'm just going to keep saying 30%, whatever. Let's say you reduce your risk during that 5 year period by 30%. But let's say the total number of events, or the total risk of events, of cardiovascular events, was only like 5% during that period, because it's such a short follow up. You take thousands of people, you have them, follow them for 5 years. Not a lot of them are going to end up having heart attacks in 5 years, but you follow them for 30, 40, 50 years, and they probably
Exactly.
will, right? So that absolute risk, okay, 30% of 5% is like a couple percent, not even. So they say, oh, it's only a 2% reduction. Okay, but what happens if that 30% reduction continues for another 30 years, 40 years?
Right.
All of a sudden, it becomes pretty meaningful, pretty large. And so you have to factor that in. And that's why it's actually better, in my opinion, to use the relative risk in these cases, to say it's a 30% reduction as opposed to not doing the thing, or, eating higher saturated fat, because, or not taking the medication, if that's what it is, because then you can extrapolate it over time a little bit easier. So that hopefully adds a bit of clarity to the sorts of things that you will hear out there.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's something I struggle with when I'm reading data because they don't give the full picture on it. A lot of times, some of them do. It's almost like compounding in a way over time in a negative direction or a positive direction,
Well,
depending on which
well,
risk you're
well,
looking at.
yeah. Usually, I would say the differences, like the actual difference between the intervention and the control, or exposure,
Right.
and lack of exposure, actually gets bigger over time too. Like proportionally gets bigger over time too. In a lot of cases, obviously, if you're looking at total risk of death, like total mortality, eventually it's going to be a 0% difference, because everyone's going to die at some point if you go long enough. But like that's one exception I can think of.
Yeah, it's like the 1% better every day concept, right? Where
Yeah,
it's minimal in
yeah,
the
yeah,
beginning, but it just grows.
yeah.
Uh,
Exactly.
awesome. So we're going to go into like specific foods too and tie this into South Asian culture as well. And then also just more like
Hmm.
recommendations on what's a daily diet look like in a plant-based version here. Now, we talked, um, talked a little bit about fiber, saturated fat. We
Mhm.
touched in cholesterol. Any other big key points that you want to hit on some of the plant-based benefits there?
Yeah, so there's we didn't really touch on cholesterol, but basically the quick notes of just eating cholesterol, like I mean diet, like in eggs, for example, is it also raises your LDL, can raise your risk of cardiovascular disease, but to a smaller degree than saturated fat, and it eventually plateaus. So it's like if you go from zero cholesterol to like a couple eggs worth per day, then you can see a significant increase in cholesterol in your blood cholesterol or LDL cholesterol. But if you add more on top of that, like take the average diet and add more, you don't really see a change because it maxes out. But anyways, that's just a little kind of nuanced note. As far as other benefits of
Wait,
plant
can we
foods,
can you
something,
explain that real
yeah.
quick?
Oh,
Sorry, I'm
okay, yeah,
cutting
yeah,
you
yeah. Sorry, sorry.
cutting you off right here. That's actually
Yeah,
really
yeah.
important. That's one of the questions I want to talk about is eggs specifically. But we'll go into what you're about to say
Okay,
next. But
yeah.
say you're somebody that has 2 eggs a day, and let's break this down to
Hmm.
egg yolk and egg whites only, if there is a difference,
Hmm.
and pointed that out if not. Um, so you have 2 eggs a day, and then you go down. Is there a difference between 0 to 2? You're saying if you're at 0 and you go to 2, you're going to have a cholesterol. It'll go up your LDL, but then if you go from like 2 to 4, you're kind of already up. It's not going to continue to increase linearly. So, am I right there?
Yeah, yeah. That's like whether or not it still increases a little bit, maybe, but like generally speaking, it's going to be pretty minor at that point.
Okay. And then does it
It,
change
it, it
versus
like
egg
plateaus,
yolk?
it flattens out. Yeah, so
Interesting.
that's
Okay.
specific to the yolks. So actually, the best trials we have for seeing the cholesterol raising effects of egg yolk, or we'll say even cholesterol, is the ones where they compare whole eggs to just egg whites, because you're essentially you have the same food, but you have that one component either removed or in there, and then you equate for calories and everything, of course.
So if you're eating, or if you have pretty solid LDL levels, your cholesterol's fine,
Mhm.
your active lifestyle, you're eating generally healthy, would you say that eggs are okay?
So that's actually a really good point. There was a study by Zong. This was 2019, I think. Um, 6 American cohorts. And what was really nice about this was they had a good range in egg intake. So one of the issues with a lot of the egg research is they'll compare like 2 eggs a week to like 4 eggs a week. It's like hardly a difference. You're not going to see much risk. But in this analysis, they had basically none to like one a day or so, or even a little bit more. Um, and in that study, they did find that higher egg consumption was associated with cardiovascular disease. However, they did something really great in their subgroup analyses. So they actually split them into groups of those with an LDL cholesterol of 70 milligrams per deciliter or less, right? Is that ideal kind of threshold I
Right.
mentioned, or above 70. And when you do that, it's only those with an LDL above 70 where there is a statistically significant increase in risk. So it
Hmm.
actually might be the case that if you're eating eggs, but you're maintaining an optimal LDL, that eggs don't increase risk. That's actually
Interesting.
possible. Whereas but if your LDL is a bit high and you're eating a lot of eggs, maybe drop the eggs and see if you can bring it down, right?
Yeah.
So it depends on where you're at. There is a bit of nuance there, a bit of like personalization.
Okay, I'm very glad you brought that up because it differs for every single person then because they need to go check what their LDL is, they need to check their blood tests and all that stuff. Because I mean,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, I eat a lot of protein. We're going to talk protein a little bit too. I eat a lot of protein. I'll have probably 1 to 2 eggs with the yolk plus a couple egg whites each morning. Um, and I do a lot of weightlifting, a lot of training. Hopefully, I don't die soon, but I mean, my LDLs
Get
were,
your blood work.
yeah, I think last time I checked, they were fine, but something I'm gonna maybe tailor back on it and see, like, eating, is there a egg consumption maximum that's just crazy, like eating 10, 20 eggs a week is really bad, or does it matter versus
I
eating
mean,
six?
I would say so. I would say when you have a contrast of about an egg a day in the available studies, it's quite consistent that you see the eggs increase risk. Now, again, barring the notion that maybe if your LDL is under 70, that might not be a problem. Obviously, understanding what I just said, but generally speaking, at that level of contrast, there is risk. Is there further risk to going up to double that, let's say? I don't know.
Right.
We don't have good data on that level of
Okay.
intake, really, at least not in enough people and in populations of thousands that we can really assess that with more confidence. But that's just something to be aware of and something to obviously test your LDL and see where it's at.
Fair. I like that. So I cut you off on the egg part, but Continuing on with cholesterol, anything else
Mhm.
to add on that one?
I think that's about it. I think it is. It's just understanding that there's a ceiling to how much of an effect cholesterol has on your LDL cholesterol levels, but understanding that it absolutely does. Like that. That's the thing where there seems to be debate around whether it has an effect. Like pretty clearly, it does have an effect. It's just more modest than we see with saturated fat, where it's just linear. Like the more saturated fat, the higher it gets, for the most part.
Great. So let's go a little bit practical here. We're talking plant-based, a plant-based diet, which means you can have some fish, you
Mhm.
can have some eggs, you can have some chicken or little bits of meat, but mainly you're intaking a lot of vegetables and fruits and legumes, nuts and seeds, stuff like that. Now, what does a proper ratio sound like across a week in terms of adding in meat that would still be healthy and considered into a plant-based diet?
Okay, so where we most consistently see risk, again, these are all probabilities, right, based on the
Sure,
available data,
that's
but where
fine.
we most consistently see risk with red meat or especially like even unprocessed red meat um, is around a 100-gram serving or about a 4-ounce serving a day. So that would be an average. Most people probably eat more than that at a serving, so you got to keep that in mind. Um, that is where we consistently see higher risk. Now, Zong, who did that egg study, also did another one on unprocessed red meat intake and found that even an increase of just 2 servings a week could increase risk, but to a very small degree. Like we're talking a few
Okay.
percent here. So if you're it depends on your risk tolerance, right? If someone's looking to absolutely minimize their risk tolerance, I would actually suggest probably keeping it under a couple servings a week, just based on that data. However, if you're tolerant to like a few percent increase here or there, like cardiovascular risk, mortality risk, and but you don't want the more substantial increases where we see 20-25% or so increase in risk, then up to even a few times a week or something might be reasonable. But that again, it all just comes down to probabilities here and personal tolerance to risk, and so I can't tell you what's right or wrong in that case. From a health viewpoint, it's really up to you to decide, or the listeners to decide.
Great. Well, at least it breaks it down a little bit. Now, the big misconception is when you're going plant-based and you're cutting out animal products, people say, well, where do I get my protein from? Right? I need meat to get protein. And, vegans don't get enough protein, plant-based people don't get enough protein, vegetarians don't get enough protein, all that. So there are options, right? There's protein in a lot of different vegetables, like a little bit, but still there. There's some grains like quinoa will have it, which I think is a seed actually. Some other, nuts, but then
Mm-hmm.
you have legumes. What are your thoughts on or plant-based people on a plant-based diet getting enough protein, and how do they make sure they are getting enough protein if they aren't?
Yeah, starting with are people on plant-based diets getting enough protein? It totally depends on the population. So we have some research on vegetarians and vegans in the UK, and these were people who were enrolled in the study back in the 90s, early 90s especially. And I think it's fair to say that the knowledge around plant-based diets was maybe less so at that point. And at this point, that population would be quite a bit older. Um, there is concern over some of them, based on this data, falling below recommendations for protein intake, and these are conventional recommendations, which I would say are already probably a bit low. So that's a reasonable concern. Now, if we look at more recent research in American vegans and vegetarians, it seems more than adequate. In fact, on a per body weight basis, at least in the Adventist populations, the vegans consume more protein than the meat eaters. That's generally because they weigh less. So per body weight, they don't need as much. Um,
Oh, interesting.
and so because they have a much lower risk of being like overweight or obese, right? And so so they need less protein to meet their body weight needs. Now, they I still think it is a good thing to emphasize protein, and that's because the conventional recommendations of zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight might be undercutting it as far as optimizing our long-term risk of cardiometabolic diseases. There's actually a brand new study that just came out yesterday, I think it was, or 2 days ago. I just posted a video on it today, around like healthy aging, and this was looking at chronic disease risk, mobility, mental status, and so on. And you see that higher protein intake is generally beneficial, especially when it's coming from plant protein sources. And that's something that I think should really be taken away from that data and prior data, is that when you look at the substitution of animal protein for plant protein in older age and long-term risk of these chronic diseases, the plant protein consistently comes out on top. When it comes to health outcomes, there's no debate there that the plant protein is healthier. The other question, though, is, well, can you get enough protein for the like physical functioning side and the strength and building muscle and that, and how does that compare? So for one, getting enough. If you think about meat and say swapping that out for plant protein sources, if you were to swap out meat for rice, you're going to be decreasing your protein intake pretty clearly. But that's a kind of an odd swap. It's not really a comparison I would make. However, if you were to swap out meat, let's say your typical 80% lean beef for even lentils, lentils actually do fall a little bit below that as well, even per calorie. So lentils are about 8 grams per 100 calories of protein, whereas the like 80% lean beef would be, I believe, about 10 grams of protein per 100 calories. So it's a little bit lower. Chickpeas are about half that at 5.5 grams per 100 calories. So you have to keep that in mind. But if you look at tofu, it's bang on. So if you were to eat the same amount of calories from tofu as your just typical beef, you'll get about the same amount of protein. You might have to eat a larger volume of tofu because it's lower in calories overall. So that's something to consider. But on a protein per calorie basis, they're very similar. So what I suggest people do is they replace these high protein animal foods with high protein plant foods. Tofu is a good one, but if you want to go even higher, textured vegetable protein like soy chunks and that sort of thing, you'll actually increase your protein intake compared to beef or compared to chicken or what have you. Seitan, which is a wheat-based protein, super, super high in protein as well. And the amount of protein can vary depending on how it's made, but it's always going to be high. That can also be a way to not just match, but increase your protein intake going from animals to plants. If you take your regular like full fat milk or even 2% milk and switch it for soy milk, you've increased your protein intake. Whereas you're getting about the same amount as you would from skim milk. You replace eggs with tofu, you increase your protein intake because tofu has more than eggs. So it's just about focusing on these higher protein options. Like that's really what it is at the end of the day. And if anyone's concerned, you can track what you're eating with like Chronometer or with MyFitnessPal. There's free apps to do that and see where your protein intake is at. And then
That's
there's
good.
a couple other questions. Yeah, there's a couple other questions about protein though. One of them is it does it have all the amino acids? That's one that comes up. Does plant protein, is it as digestible as animal protein? So I think those are kind of the next things to cover. For one, all plants contain all of the 9 essential amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein that we don't produce. That's why they're essential, these 9. We need to consume them in our diet. All plants contain all of them. So anyone who says that they don't are misinformed. But they do contain varying proportions. So some foods will be higher in certain amino acids, lower in others, whereas animal foods are generally fairly balanced in their amino acid profiles. That doesn't mean that the plant protein sources are inferior. It just means you need to eat more than like one food in your day. So just vary your diet a little bit and you're good. You don't need to focus on combining at each meal. I know that used to be a myth, but your body will take care of it. It'll combine your breakfast with your lunch, with your dinner. Don't worry about it. Just eat a bit of variety, eat some grains, eat some legumes, eat some nuts, and you'll be covered. Now, on the thing of digestibility or the concerns around digestibility, so you'll often hear claims, actually sometimes suggesting that plant proteins are substantially less digestible than animal proteins. Like I've heard claims of like 60% less digestible or something, just bizarre numbers. These are based largely on 2 scoring systems called the PDCAS and the DS. So the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, or the PDCAS, and then the digestible indispensable amino acid score, or the DS. To make it quick, the PDCAS is typically measured by feeding different foods to rodents, measuring how much protein goes in and how much comes out the other end, and the difference is presumably what was absorbed by the rodents. A couple issues with that. For one, we aren't rodents. Our protein needs are different. Our digestive tracts are different. Should go without saying. And the second part is that because they're measuring the difference between mouth and excretion, it doesn't account for the amount of protein that might be digested by microbes in the gut, because the microbes, the bacteria and whatnot in the gut will chew up some of the protein as well. Now, with the DS, they try to account for that a little bit. So they actually do it in pigs in this case, which are maybe closer to humans, but again, not the same. We can't necessarily extrapolate the results to humans. But they actually insert a tube through the abdomen to the end of the small intestine, so they remove a lot of that bacterial digestion that'll happen in the large intestine. And so it might be a bit more of an accurate marker that way. But in this case, they use primarily raw food, so even raw legumes. And when you cook legumes, which is how we eat them, you increase digestibility. So that's also a
Got it.
potential issue. But the biggest issue that applies to both of these, this is something that I can almost guarantee you anybody who cites these scores does not understand. I've even seen like protein researchers who don't seem to understand this point. It's that the scores are not based on the overall digestibility of the protein. It's based on the amount of protein, or the amount of the least available amino acid is absorbed. So to kind of illustrate that, let's say we'll take eggs as an example, balanced amino acid profile. And let's say you measure how much is absorbed of each of the individual amino acids. You look at the lowest amino acid there, the lowest available amino acid, and that will be the reference score. That's what you're comparing to.
Got it.
And then you take, um, let's say you're taking seitan, like a wheat-based protein, and it's low in lysine, one of the amino acids.
Right.
Now you'll measure the protein digestibility. You could digest and absorb 100% of the protein. Let's just say hypothetically, but the lysine, and I'm making this number up because I don't know exactly. Let's say it only contains about 40% of the lysine that you need in your diet. That protein is going to be considered only 40% digestible based on the DS score, and that's because even if you absorb it all, you're still going to be missing out on 60% of your needs of that amino acid, and that's the least available amino acid in that protein. Thus, it gets a score of 40 out of 100. Right? Does it kind of make sense why it's a kind of a bizarre way to? Yeah. So it doesn't tell you about the protein digestibility. And guess what? If you ate that food in a daily diet that also incorporated some like beans or tofu or whatever, you're going to get enough lysine from those other sources. So all of a sudden, it could be much closer to 100%. Right, so it's totally biasing these scoring systems are designed to be used in cases of food insecurity where you're actually relying on like a couple foods to meet your nutritional needs. And in those cases, yes, focusing on foods that have a higher score to make sure that you're getting adequate protein and all the essential amino acids, I can understand that. It does not mean that in a diet where you have some options and you can have a bit of variety that it really means anything, because it doesn't. But what we can do is we can measure total digestibility. And when you do that, even in pigs using the same methodology, but you don't subtract points based on amino acid scores, you see that even cooked legumes are hovering in the 80s to 90s as far as their scores, with 100 being a perfect score. And guess what? Meat hovers around 90 as well. Like you're getting pretty comparable scores. And in the limited data we have in humans, you see that the difference between high quality plant protein sources and animal protein sources is like a few percent maybe. It's tiny. It's negligible. So this whole idea of digestibility doesn't really pan out. Of course, at the end of the day, what matters is like what is the end result? Do you get the same gains? Do you get the same improvements in strength? Which we can get into. But I just want to make sure you understood all that stuff, or if you have any questions about that stuff before we hop into the outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, I think I got it for the most part. And just getting a very diverse diet. There are very different types of protein from plants. When you're eating, different legumes, different vegetables, all that stuff, even like tofu or other things. Do you have like recommendations on like your big hitters for protein and under a plant-based diet? Is that your tofu?
Well, I mean, I like tofu just because I find it to be quite versatile. I know some people don't like tofu, and that's totally fine.
Yeah.
But I find it to be versatile. I also have these soy chunks, which are like concentrated soy protein, and they're like incredibly high, crazy high in protein, and also have a lot of the fiber intact and whatnot. That's a really good option. But then if you're looking for non-soy options, I love like lentil pastas, chickpea pastas. They tend to be really high. A lot of the veggie grounds, often made with like wheat-based proteins, are really good too. And then seitan, like there's a lot of very high protein sources. Not that you need all these, and then protein supplements as well. There's quite a variety of options.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, I've been on plant-based like protein supplement, like the protein powder in my protein shakes through workouts. Been plant-based for the last few years, and I still see strength gains, and so it's the one thing where it's
Hmm.
better on my gut, better on my digestive system. I do have animal product like meats like chicken mainly or fish throughout the day, but not as much as I used to.
Yeah.
And we can keep going on this. There's a few other things I want to get to as well. And one thing I want you to tap into
Sure.
real quick is,
Can I just finish up
yeah.
the protein thing
Oh yeah,
really quick
please,
though?
please
Just like
finish up
the
yeah, yeah.
outcome. Yeah, just one thing I do want to highlight though is all of that stuff about the amino acid profiles, digestibility. It's all moot if at the end of the day you get the same result, and that's what we've
Mm,
seen now a couple times. There have been at least a couple trials now where they've pit vegan or near vegan diets, like 100% plant based or like 99% plant based, versus an omnivorous diet loaded with animal protein, but you match protein. So you're getting the same amount of protein. These are higher amounts of protein, so 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight or higher, which is ideal for strength and muscle gains. And then you have them on a resistance training program for a number of weeks, few months. Usually, I think the shortest one was 3 months, and the longest, or maybe 2 months, 2 to 3 months, and then the longest was about 5 months. I could be off on those numbers a bit. It's been a minute since I've looked, but you get the same result at the end of the day as far as strength and mass gains. So lean mass gains. So
yep.
the end result is the same. It doesn't matter whether it's from animal or plant protein. The amount is important, and so as long as you're getting that amount, which you can get from plant foods, you get the same result. So no need to get super bogged down into these like tiny, minute details, even though I provided some of that anyway.
No, it's great. I love it. And when you say 1.6 grams per body weight, are you saying per body weight in kilograms or in pounds?
Per kilogram.
Per
Kilogram.
kilogram. Okay, so that would translate to about zero
Yeah.
point 0.7 to zero point 0.8 grams per body weight
Yeah, it's like
per
0.75, I think,
pound.
is
Yeah,
almost exact. Yeah.
yeah. Cool. That's really good. Really good stuff on the protein. Now, if people were to supplement that and use creatine or just BCAAs
Mm-hmm.
or collagen, just to note, it's generally or they are from animal products stripped from that.
Creatine's not.
Uh, Creatine's
Creatine
not?
isn't.
Okay, correct me on that.
Yeah,
Cool.
creatine, like creatine monohydrate is, as far as I know, exclusively or almost exclusively synthetic. So
Okay.
now there might be other sources, other types of creatine. I don't know, but monohydrate is the most commonly used one.
Okay.
But
Cool. Well,
collagen, you're right.
yeah.
Collagen is animal derived.
All right. Good. Well, glad we're clear on that one too. What is your take on dairy? Now, I'll give you a thing where back when I was in high school, I had a lot of acne, and doctors would be like, "Oh, it's not your diet. It's dairy's not a problem." And I was drinking a lot of milk because, I wanted to get taller. You get strong bones, you get big muscle, all that stuff from milk. I even did when I was in college. I even did GOMAD, which is a gallon of milk a day for 3 weeks,
Oh, I know.
and it's
Yeah.
I did it, and I was lifting a lot, so I got stronger in that 3 week period, but it was not the best on my gut. To this day, I don't drink milk anymore. Like, I don't drink dairy milk anymore. Very rarely, like a splash here or there, but it's mostly like almond milk or oat milk. What are your and I do believe that dairy has an impact on inflammation in the body, and that when I was told that it wasn't causing my acne, I thought the doctors were wrong. If I look back at it now, what's your take on dairy? Any opinions there?
Yeah, so well, let's touch on the things that you'd mentioned first, the inflammation, the acne. So, as far as inflammation, actually, it's not really clear that dairy causes inflammation, at least not by the conventional markers that are typically measured. We have a number of trials looking at that, and in fact, some actually suggest it might lower that, um, at least in certain populations. However, when it comes to skin health, the acne side, it's one of the potential variables, dietary variables that matter. So the ones that we have some evidence for, I'd say the strongest evidence thus far is more on like sugary foods,
Hmm.
or even refined carbohydrate foods, or sources. There are some studies looking at low glycemic diets and acne, and you do see improvements. So that would be a diet more focused on whole food carbohydrates or lower in carbohydrates. Um, so that's possible. The other one is more just like greasy foods in general. Obviously, that's a very broad kind of category: fried foods,
Right.
fast foods, that kind of stuff. But then the third is dairy. There's actually, I know of one doctor who is trying to get a trial going. I don't know what the status on that is yet, but a really well designed trial that would hopefully answer some questions about this. We do have some observational evidence right now suggesting that dairy might play a role. Um, So it's one of the three variables that I'd say possibly, causes acne.
Okay.
But we just need a bit more stronger data to really hone in, right? But then people like yourself, myself, like we've had that experience. Of course, I changed more things than just dairy intake. So it's something that I do think warrants research, and I'd like to see more solid research on. Now, as far as like hard health outcomes, things like, again, cardiovascular disease and certain cancers and that, um, what's interesting about dairy is it's such a mixed bag. There's so many different kinds of dairy. There's low fat, there's full fat, there's yogurt, there's cheese,
Yeah.
there's butter, creams. Because there's so many different kinds, they can actually impact our risk differently. Like, so for cardiovascular disease risk, um,
Hmm.
low fat dairy tends to be protective. Full fat dairy, it kind of depends on what you're comparing to. So compared to like refined carbohydrates, it's pretty neutral. Compared to polyunsaturated fats, it's dairy fats generally worse. Um, so that's potentially variable. And then there's other things like cheese, for example, seems to have less of an effect than other saturated fat or dairy fat sources. Why that is, there's some speculation around what's called the milk fat globule that
Mm.
sort of captures some of the fat. Um, there's potential calcium mediating a bit of that association. It's really hard to say, and so cheese is actually typically associated with better health outcomes. But then if you compare it to something like avocados, which one study did, the avocado appeared to be healthier. And so, relative to avocado, cheese might not be so healthy. It's always a compared to what kind of question. You have to
Right.
frame it in that sense. Um, and for cognitive health too. So dairy seems to reduce the risk of Alzheimer's, but increase the risk of Parkinson's disease. For cancer, it's a bit of a mixed bag
Mm.
too. There's actually pretty strong evidence suggesting that dairy reduces colorectal cancer risk, but then increases, somewhat weaker evidence, but increases the risk of prostate cancer. So a bit of a mixed bag once again.
Right.
Um, so these are all things that you kind of need to be aware of. The nice thing though is a lot of these benefits, like the benefits for colorectal cancer, might actually just be driven by the calcium content. And if that's the case, well, then you could just have other high calcium foods. You can switch to a plant-based milk that's fortified with calcium and still, presumably reap those benefits, which I'd like to see more data on as well. So yeah, mixed bag, I would say.
Great. I mean that's a great rundown on dairy specifically because I always have that trouble with me. I don't know about it, and you see like
But I would
cheese
say
and you're
butter
sprinkling.
is one to avoid or limit. Not necessarily everyone needs to avoid, but definitely limit, especially if LDL is not optimal.
Okay, I have butter. I butter the pan with for my eggs in the morning, so I might
Oh,
just switch that off. I mean, being on, I mean, I use a little bit, but that
yeah,
stick of butter will last me like a month or so. So
that's
a
fair.
little
Yeah,
bit.
it also matters. The dose matters too, for sure. But
But yeah, switched over to, avocado oil mainly with all my cooking. Olive oil, not to heat it. I got rid of, and you actually mentioned this canola oil. I actually got rid of the seed oils and canola oils. I know there's a big debate going on with that, and you know, you have the animal-based people saying eat protein, don't eat vegetables. You have the plant-based saying eat your vegetables, don't eat your meat. And it's then you got the whole seed oils, like seed oils are good, seed oils are bad. There, and I like what you've been saying today, where you're bringing up a little bit of the more detail into the research, like how you're comparing relative versus absolute, or comparing versus a rodent versus us with different digestive systems or other ways. Any thoughts on, because when you're looking at this and you go on Instagram, you go on YouTube, you just hear conflicting diet
mm-hmm.
information, and some of it could be social media based clickbait. But any thoughts on that? On with all the differences going on right now in the debates.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem with a lot of the social media stuff is that everyone has a platform. Doesn't matter how knowledgeable you are, and just because someone has credentials doesn't mean they're trustworthy either. Like I think the seed oil thing is the perfect example of this. It's one of the most like as far as the research goes, it's one of the most clear answers we have in nutrition is that these things are health promoting. Like it could not be more clear, really. We have long-term randomized controlled trials on substituting saturated fat for polyunsaturated fats in the form of these seed oils. We have plenty of observational research that supports the same conclusions, and then we have research on biomarkers. So like when we consume these fats, they end up in our blood or tissues, and we can measure the levels in our blood and tissues. And the higher levels are which is a more objective measure of how much you're consuming, are associated with good health outcomes. So it's like it's so clear. Yet what I find happens, and it extends far beyond this topic of the seed oils, is that these isolated mechanisms that people will point to, so they'll talk about oxidation of LDL, or they might use
Yeah.
other fancy terms. They might talk about um, various steps in the pathway of atherosclerotic plaque development, or something. It, to the layperson, that sounds so convincing. I would bet that sounds more convincing than me saying, in a cohort of 150,000 people followed for 30 years, higher intake of polyunsaturated fats, primarily from vegetable oils, was associated with a X% reduction in risk of cardiovascular disease. Now, what I just said is what matters. That's the risk, the end result of you eat more, you have a lower risk. But someone who's talking about the initiation of plaque development and the peroxidation of these LDL particles, and like all of that stuff just sounds more convincing. But if anyone listening to this is going to take something away from it, it's to understand that these mechanisms, these isolated pathways and mechanisms, almost never pan out into the actual end result outcome. And that's because our bodies are complex, and there are dozens to hundreds of these different mechanisms occurring every time you consume something. Just think about that. Some are going to be positive, some are going to be negative. What's the net result at the end of the day? Because nothing is occurring in isolation. That's why looking at the end result, do people drop dead of a heart attack if they eat more of X or Y? Those are the questions that need to be asked. And that's really what should drive dietary recommendations. And that's ultimately what does when we look at either government or medical organizations and their recommendations. It's totally derived around that. This seed oil stuff just drives me absolutely nuts. I did a 4-hour debate on it on Simon Hill's podcast for anyone who's interested, but it's a long haul. But like, yeah, it's a topic that I've delved into a lot.
Yeah, when people write complete books on it, like I have Deep Nutrition in the back over here, and Dr. Kate Shanahan talks strictly on how seed oils, like canola, your hateful eights canola oil, cottonseed oil, rapeseed oil, all those have polyunsaturated fatty acids that get
Mm-hmm.
oxidized. And so you need your
Yeah.
if you don't have your antioxidants with it, they get oxidized, which is going to
Yeah.
cause damage in
Yeah,
the
that's all.
interior.
Yeah, it's
Go
just
ahead.
that whole, like, we also have trials on like antioxidant supplementation, and they don't reduce, like, it's all this stuff is. And I would bet, if I had to guess, I haven't read that book, but if I had to guess, um, it's almost entirely chapters upon chapters of descriptions of isolated mechanisms happening in the body. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there's a couple chapters. I mean, I really enjoyed the book, and it actually made me
Yeah,
stop off of vegetables. I'm gonna be completely honest. I
yeah,
just went over to the ones I said, but this is what I'm bringing you on because, like you say, the other, which is
yeah.
great to tell us why, like where, and which you just laid out
Mm-hmm.
for us, and it's important for people to know. Okay, well, maybe you're looking at different mechanisms, maybe you're looking at different studies, and ultimately the person has to make a decision on what they should be consuming. And I mean, obviously, don't
Mm-hmm.
pour whatever oil it is. Just don't be drinking it all the time. Just have
Well,
limited
I mean, yeah, the
amounts in
calorie
moderation.
density alone is
Yeah,
not going to be. Yeah, the
yeah,
calorie
yeah.
density alone of oil is not going to be, or butter or whatever, is not going to be great.
But great. I mean, but this kind of leads into my next point, which is a little bit outside of moderation, which goes into our whole focus of the South Asian diet, right? And like a typical South Asian
Mm-hmm.
diet, at least growing up, you have, if you go to the home cooked food, South Asian is different than like restaurants, which are covered in like butter, high sugar. But we're seeing a lot of disease, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity. These rates are increasing in our community. And that's why I started this podcast, to really bring on health leaders like yourself to educate us all on how can we change some of our dietary habits and our lifestyles to live healthier and to reverse this trend in which we're going. So, what is your take on the South Asian diet, like a general one, and how can we improve that to be more plant based and focus on like what would that look like on a plate? Um, yeah, in a more practical way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, South Asian populations are interesting because they have some potentially positive aspects to their diets on average. Obviously, there's some variability, but some positive aspects, like the vegetarianism, for example. Vegetarianism generally associated with better health, especially compared to high meat diets. But then on the other hand, we have very high refined carbohydrate intake a lot of the time, a lot of white flours and white rice and that kind of stuff. And those are just a couple aspects, especially like when I went to India, I felt like it was always sugary beverages too, like the Coca-Colas
Yeah.
and things like that when available. I remember my family there was like appalled that I was good with just water instead of having the like whatever Sprite they were trying to give me. Or, it's a very funny kind of cultural difference. And so there's some positives and potentially some negatives. The other side of it is that we need to be more careful about our diet and lifestyle because we are at higher risk of cardiovascular disease, diabetes than most other populations. There's actually some potentially genetic components to that. Like we tend to have higher lipids, higher LDL cholesterol, higher LP little a, which is another marker that increases risk that is totally genetically determined. We tend to have higher ones. We also tend to have lower what are called fat thresholds. So we each have an individual threshold of body fat that we can put on before we develop diabetes. And South Asians tend to have a lower threshold. So we don't have as much wiggle room. We tend to store more fat around our organs, which increases insulin resistance and other issues. We tend to have higher blood pressure at younger ages too. So I just want to emphasize that, like, yeah, we still have control over a lot of this stuff, but we're up against it, and so we need to be more careful. I'll just kind of hop into some of the diet stuff then. So you wanted to know about like what a healthy sort of South
Yeah.
Asian style diet would be? Yeah.
Yeah. What
So
changes can we make?
I think for one, focusing more on whole grains, I think is a big one. So switching from your white flour to whole wheat flour, switching from um, other, like even white rice to, if possible, things like quinoa and so on, which generally be healthier options. Um, that would be one side of it. The other side is I think focusing on some aspects that are already inherent to South Asian diets. That would be legumes, lentils,
Yeah.
beans, chickpeas. These are already pretty central to South Asian cuisine, and they're incredibly beneficial. The latest meta-analysis on legume intake and all-cause mortality found that the benefits peaked at like 400 grams a week. That's like maybe 4 servings a week, roughly.
Mm.
And so, I mean, more is fine as well, but even relatively modest amounts of these foods seem to be quite beneficial, and more certainly isn't going to hurt. So incorporating those regularly, I think, could be huge. I think veggies generally make it into a lot of South Asian cuisine already, at least
Right.
as a side, and I think continuing on with that. But it's essentially taking most dietary guidelines. You got your whole grains, legumes, you got your fruits and veggies, and then nuts and seeds and liquid oils, ideally, and just incorporating that into what a South Asian cuisine would look like. And so it would be simply substituting a lot of the refined grains for whole grains. Maybe instead of butter, because that's pretty common, replacing that, I would say, with a liquid oil. If not a seed oil, then olive oil or something like that.
Right.
Um, and then focusing on legumes as a plant protein source. Of course, if you want to incorporate some other lean protein sources, that's fine. But having legumes as a centerpiece, at least that 4 times a week or so. I think these are all really positive changes that can be made that probably aren't too far off from what's already being done, but just attacking the low hanging fruit. Oh, and then avoiding sugar sweetened beverages, if not entirely limiting sugar sweetened beverage intake.
Right. I mean, that's what I preach as well. Now, my question is, when you're doing more lentils and more beans to
Yeah.
get that protein in, and you're gonna have veggies on the side, and maybe you'll have like a roti or you have some rice or quinoa, your
Mm-hmm.
balance gets out of whack in terms of too much carbs at once. Because I like to follow something where you have a balanced macro portion of your plate would be following a zone diet where it's 40% carb, 30% protein, 30% fat in terms of calorie count. And do you have any like thoughts on that? If you're going too much carbs there, you still have to keep the lentils in balance there, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, when it comes to health outcomes, honestly, the macro ratios don't really matter that much. It's more so about the overall quality. However, if there is a specific ratio you're aiming for, perhaps for athletics or physique or something, then you might want to include more of those like like I said, soy chunks or TVP,
Right.
or even tofu, like making like I actually have a vegan butter chicken recipe on my website. It's from my mom, but we replace it with tofu, or you can do like a butter tofu type thing.
Awesome.
That could be an option. There are other options as far as those higher protein foods, and then even including a protein supplement isn't a terrible idea, as I've already mentioned. But the diet as a whole can still very much resemble that typical South Asian or Indian diet, but just tweaking a few things to make them a bit healthier, and then just emphasizing some of those plant protein sources.
Love it. We're going to wrap up here. I mean, Dr. Matt, you've been super helpful, very informative, very honest, real. It's a great discussion with you, and I think this will help so many people. It was kind of balanced, right? A lot of evidence-based stuff, very some based off your own experience too. And I appreciate you taking the time. So again, everyone can find you at drmatthewnagra.com or on Instagram, dr.matthewnagra. Conclude for us, like, what's your mission? What's up and coming for you? What's going on? And yeah, tell us a little bit more what you got planned.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's always great to speak to, especially the South Asian community. It's something that I'm actually speaking at an event next week. Speaking of things that are coming up, I mean, it'll probably be before this gets posted publicly, but it's a cool little thing coming up here in Vancouver, specific for that population. And I've also got a paper coming out on plant-based meat alternatives and cardiovascular disease. So these would be like plant-based meats, Beyond Meats, that kind of stuff. That'll be coming out hopefully in the next month or so. I'm just waiting for the journal to get the proofs back to me, but I will definitely be sharing that once it's out. And as far as my mission, I mean, I just want to give people the information they need to make healthier choices, or to at least make informed choices about their health. I think that's the big thing. A lot of times, people are making choices thinking that they're doing good when really they might be harming themselves. Perhaps they've been misled. Whereas if someone chooses to smoke, they know they're doing something that isn't great for them, and they're still choosing to do it. And in that case, at least they're making an informed decision. Not saying that I'm saying nutrition is on par with smoking as far as how bad it is, but at least I just want people to be informed about the choices they are making.
Love it. And I appreciate you being on, and I know the listeners will love this. So, Dr. Matt Nagra, really appreciate it. Catch you again.